Welcome to the Relaunch Your Career podcast. I am your host, Leah Lambert, career and interview coach and founder of Relaunch Me, where we help you find the work that you were meant to do. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first episode of the Relaunch Your Career podcast for 2021. Today, I am joined on the podcast by Lindy Alexander, an award-winning freelance food, travel, and lifestyle writer who I've been very fortunate enough to have worked with on some articles for Seek in the last few years. Lindy's work has been published in numerous digital and print publications, including Sunday Life, The Age, the Sydney Morning Herald, The Guardian, Travel and Indulgence, Delicious, Good Food, SBS Life, and Jetstar magazine, just to name a few. She has also created content for brands and organisations and companies, including Seek, the Royal Australian and New Zealand College of Psychiatrists, Indeed, and the Great Ocean Road regional destination websites. Lindy won Best Food Travel Story in the 2020 Annual Australian Society of Travel Writers Awards for Excellence, and she's also completed a PhD in social work. Is anyone else feeling a little inadequate? Welcome to the podcast, Lindy.
Thank you. I was doing a webinar last week and I had a very similar introduction, and I just wanted to assure everybody that I know that sounds quite insufferable and like I'm an overachiever, but I can assure you I'm not.
Well, I'm sure it's something that you have worked very hard at over time, which we're keen to explore today. How are things up in Castlemaine this morning?
They are steamy and humid today. We've had heaps and heaps of rain. It's really been an unusual summer for us, but it gets really hot here in summer, so I must admit the cooler weather is a welcome relief.
Yes, well, we've been waiting all morning for this terrible storm to hit. So let's hope it doesn't arrive in the middle of our interview. So look, Lindy, I'm really excited to have you on the show, as I know that you have a great story to tell. And we also have a lot of people in our community who dream of becoming a freelance writer or actually earning income from their writing. You've had a great deal of success with your writing, but you actually started in a completely unrelated career. So I was wondering if we can start there and whether you're happy to share a little bit about your background before becoming a full-time writer.
Absolutely. So that's right. I have been a freelance writer for the last 10 years, but before that, I was a social worker. So after I finished school, I was like so many people and I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I mean, I had interests that I thought I might want to pursue, and they were broadly around the idea of helping people and serving people in some way. But other than that, I didn't really know what I wanted to do. So I enrolled in an arts degree, and at the same time, I actually enrolled in a diploma of interpreting because I was fluent in Auslan, Australian Sign Language, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to work with the deaf community or be an interpreter. I just didn't really know what I wanted to do. So I enrolled in an arts degree. I did a year of an arts degree and thought, I don't know if this is for me. I loved all the variety of subjects. I was curious about lots and lots of different things, but I've quickly realised that psychology wasn't going to be a good fit for me, mostly because of all the statistics involved. And so I was looking at other opportunities, and I thought maybe a way of working with the deaf community would be to become a speech pathologist. So I did a year of speech pathology and then thought, no, this is not for me either. Went back and finished my arts degree. And in one of my electives that I could do in my arts degree was a social work subject. And I remember sitting in the lecture theatre thinking, this is it. This is exactly what I want to do. And I really felt like that this is what I want to do forever. I felt at home with the ideas of social work and social justice and the way in which it worked with people to hear their stories and to help them empower themselves. And so it felt like coming home in a way, finding a profession like that. So I worked as a social worker for 10 years within the deaf community, so working with families who had deaf children in early childhood intervention.
Wow. And can I ask, so your background in Auslan. Was that like, did you have a family member that suffered from from hearing loss? Is that how you became interested in that area?
No, so the high school that I went to had a deaf integration program. And so there were deaf students at the school and we had interpreters in our classrooms. And I remember just being totally fascinated by it. And so I went to lunchtime classes and then I did it as a VCE subject. And it was just something that I tend to get really passionate about things and go all in. And I just loved it. And this whole alternative world and language opened up to me. And I wasn't sure how I could make that work as my career. So I thought maybe I could be an interpreter. But I quickly realised that I didn't want to be that conduit between two people. I wanted to have a voice in the room, if you like.
Oh, that's so interesting. And so then did you go on and then study social work as soon as you finished your arts degree?
I think I went overseas for a year to Canada, but knowing that I still wanted to be a social worker, then I came back and did my social work degree. Yep.
And so what were the most rewarding parts for you working as a social worker?
I think it's such a privilege to have people open up for me, I was doing family visits. So I was going into families' homes at an incredibly vulnerable time in their life when they just had a diagnosis that their child had a hearing loss. And to have people open up their home, but also their stories and their lives and share their grief. Often it was their grief or their disbelief with you, felt like a huge privilege. And I think being able to advocate or help them advocate for themselves and help them feel like they had been heard and sit with them and hold that space for them, that was definitely one of the most rewarding parts for me.
And for people who don't perhaps know much about social work, are you able to explain, what is the sort of definition of a social worker or what are they there to do?
That's a good question. So I think social work is really there to recognise that people go through all sorts of difficulties and challenges in their life, and social workers are really there to support people through navigating that space. And so the difference, I think, there's a lot of overlap between psychology and social work, but for me, the appeal of social work was that it recognised that society and the way that we interact with society has a big impact on people. So the systems and the programs and the way that we live within our society is impacted by all those structures. So if you have a disability, some people might look at that and say, that person has a disability, whereas a social worker would look at that situation and say, society kind of not causes that disability, but there are barriers that society has for those people. And can we make more opportunities for equal access? So can we have captions? Can we advocate for captions in movie theatres? Or, if someone's got a physical disability, are there ways to make spaces more accessible for people? So it recognises that people are also disabled by the kind of environmental structures, if you like.
So you worked in this area for 10 years, which is a very niche area of social work.
Yeah.
Social work can be a very challenging role. What do you think are some of the biggest challenges that face social workers in their job?
I think there's a huge amount of work, and often the people that you're working with have really complex lives. And we all have complex lives, but often when people need or want the services of a social worker, they're in a point of crisis or a point of trauma. And so often the help or the support you can give them is limited by your program or who you're working for or your funding or the boundaries of your workplace policies. And it can be frustrating that you can see a pathway in which you could help that person by potentially, providing 12 ongoing counselling sessions, but maybe your organisation doesn't have funding for you to do that and you can only do 2. And so I think there's some frustrations around some of those bigger systemic issues. And I think too, a big issue for a lot of social workers is if you don't have support, you can burn out really easily. And I think for me, towards the end, I was definitely experiencing what's called compassion fatigue, where you feel that you've given and given, and it's very hard to give anymore.
And I think a lot of people who I've spoken to who are looking to leave that space usually are people who are strong helpers and they really enjoy helping and caring for their friends and family. But I guess that strength of theirs becomes overused and they feel like they've got nothing left to give at the end of the day.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for me, because I was working in an organisation where education was the focus, I think that it wasn't necessarily set up to support the kind of therapeutic professions in a way. And so ideas like reflective practice, where you have the opportunity perhaps monthly to sit down and not only debrief about what happened in a particular family situation or a family you're working with, but to reflect on your own responses to that family, like your own biases and values and beliefs. That's really important in being a social worker or a psychologist or someone within those therapeutic professions. And if you don't have that opportunity, it's really difficult to separate your work from your life, I think.
Yes. Yeah. So, Lindy, you made the transition into freelance writing about a decade ago. Where did your love of writing originally come from?
Well, I'm someone who has always loved words and books, and I've always loved to write, but I never really contemplated a career as a writer. I think in my mind, I had this idea that there were two possible options for people who were writers, and one was to become a journalist. And in my mind, I had this idea of journalists as hard-nosed people who were kind of walking the pavement and knocking on doors and asking really difficult questions and getting into scuffles. And I didn't want to do that. And then my other idea of a writer was an author. And I think I fell into that trap of thinking creative people like writers and authors, they don't make any money. And so I never considered the opportunities or the potential of becoming a writer. I never even thought about it in any kind of serious way. It was just something that I did and something that I loved doing.
Probably there's more degrees now and more courses that are really geared towards writing than there used to be. So it probably wasn't an option that, when you're at school, you would have even considered.
No, I just, that career path wasn't open to me. And I think in a way still that kind of world of freelance writing, it's hard to know exactly how to break in. It's a bit hidden. And I don't think until you know that there is a potential pathway for you, I don't think you know that, actually you don't need qualifications or credentials. You can actually just pitch an idea to an editor, which I'm sure we'll talk about soon.
Yeah, I'm going to definitely talk to you a little bit more about that. Can you tell us a little bit about, from the intro that I read out before, you write about travel, you write about food, you write about health and well-being, and I know you do a lot of career articles and many more. Can you tell us about this variety of writing that you currently do and how that's all sort of happened for you?
Yeah, so I do two main types of writing. So one is feature articles, so articles for magazines and newspapers and online publications, and that has shifted a little bit. So when I first started writing, it was very much in the health space, drawing on my kind of social work knowledge, as well as being in the parenting space, because that was the stage in my life that I was going through. And now it's very firmly in the nice, lovely things space, which is food and travel and lifestyle. And then the other type of writing I do is for corporates, universities, non-profits, businesses, and that's around all sorts of things. So it might be around HR and recruitment, might be around health, business, finance, all different topics.
And so once you've got your foot in the door and you're doing some writing, have those opportunities come to you or have you sought some of those out yourself?
I think initially when you're starting out, there's a lot of you putting yourself out there and maybe getting a rejection, maybe getting nothing back from an editor or an organisation until you get some traction, and then you build a relationship or a connection with that person. They come to see you as a reliable, efficient, easy person to work with, and then the work does come to you. So I've definitely noticed in the last few years I'm pitching, so I'm submitting my ideas less to editors, and I'm finding that they're coming to me and saying, we want a story written about this, could you write this for us? Which is such a lovely position to be in, because pitching your idea, approaching an editor with your idea, it takes time to research it and to make sure that that story idea has got legs. And so when an editor comes to you, they've saved you all that groundwork.
Yes, that must be a very nice place to be in.
So nice.
Can you tell us about some of the more interesting writing pieces that you've been engaged to write?
Yeah, sure. So I moved into travel writing a few years ago because I'm someone who quite likes a challenge, and travel writing was always something, even within freelance writing circles, that everyone said it's really hard. Like, it's difficult. It's the dream job. Everybody wants to be a travel writer. You'll never make it work. And so I was like, oh, I don't mind a challenge. And so I went after it and I tried to get my foot in the door. And it is hard and it is really competitive, and lots of people want to be travel writers, but it's totally doable and possible. And the way I did that was by using my local knowledge. So I live in Castlemaine. There was lots of interesting food events and things happening. And so I used my local knowledge to pitch a story, a travel story about Castlemaine, even though I live here. And then that led on to other travel stories. And I think for me, in terms of travel, in 2019, I think I did 5 overseas trips. So I had an incredible trip to Canada, and I went to Thailand twice, and I went to the Philippines. So I've been really lucky in terms of my travel opportunities that I've got to do. And just before COVID hit, I got to take my dad on this wonderful trip to the Gold Coast, where he just had incredible experiences that we would never usually be able to do. So we took him up in a helicopter and we had a hot air balloon flight. So these kind of once in a lifetime experiences actually happen quite regularly when you're doing this kind of work. But I've also written stories for newspapers and magazines that have really meant a lot to me. And one of my earlier stories was I was prompted by, I was having coffee with a friend, and she had been telling me that a friend of hers, their son had died unexpectedly. He was 19, had died unexpectedly while travelling in South America. And as she was telling me about her friend who had just lost her son and the grief that this friend was experiencing, but also the difficulty in terms of finding out information when you didn't speak the language, I started thinking, I wonder, is this a common experience? How many young Australians die overseas, and what are the implications for families trying to kind of repatriate these bodies back and not knowing about the kind of final moments? And so I wrote this really big feature for The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald about young Australians who died overseas. And that was an article that for me that really sticks in my memory, because again, it was a real privilege to hear these family stories and for them to trust me in telling these stories in a way that was sensitive and tactful and accurate, with the hope that other people might read it and kind of learn, because some of these young people were engaging in activities that they probably wouldn't do in Australia, but like riding a motorbike without a helmet in Southeast Asia. And that was part of their motivation for doing that. So being able to help people tell their stories. And I've written lots. I've written stories about death doulas, so people who help people have good deaths, about edible insects, the trend of people getting married once they have children. So all sorts of kind of light and fluffy and heavier subjects as well.
Wow, I definitely remember reading that article that you were talking about then, because I travelled in South America for a couple of months years ago, and I remember thinking I feel like I was lucky to survive that trip. So I do remember reading that. So look, Lindy, when I talk to people in career counselling sessions about becoming a writer, many people feel like they just have to, jump off this big cliff and leave their current job and say, right now I'm a writer. Can you tell us how you made the transition? Was it a slow burn for you, or did you take a big leap off a cliff?
No, it was totally a slow burn. And I think in retrospect, I had no idea that I would transition to being a writer. In my mind, I was a social worker, and that's how I identified myself. And I really believed that I would be a social worker forever. And that's why I did my PhD in social work. But as I was doing my PhD in social work, I was pregnant with my first child, and I had this time, like I had a break from my job and I had a break from doing my PhD when I was on maternity leave. And that afforded me this little container of time where no one had any expectations of me of doing anything. And I thought, I would love to pursue writing, and I had no idea how to go about it. So I enrolled in a short online course with what was then the Sydney Writers Centre, just about feature writing for magazines and newspapers. I talked to different people. I listened to a few podcasts. There weren't that many podcasts around, read some blogs, and just thought, I'm just going to do this. I'm not going to tell anyone. I told my partner, but that was it. And within a few weeks, I'd sent off an idea for a story, and an editor had commissioned me. I wrote the story. It went online. I had $400 in my pocket after I got paid, and I thought, someone's going to pay me to write. And so I was hooked. And so I kept parenting. I eventually went back to my social work job 2 days a week. I was finishing off my PhD. And in the evenings and on weekends, if I had an idea, I'd pitch it. I'd send an idea to an editor. And if they commissioned me, if they said yes, then I would write it. And if they said no, I'd be like, okay, I wasn't relying on it. And I think because I didn't have this pathway planned out, it just enabled me to experiment and not put too much of a heavy pressure on myself to succeed immediately, because there's lots of rejection in writing. There's really a lot.
I love the word experiment, and I think that's what it's about, isn't it? It's not putting that pressure on. It's actually just thinking, this is just a little experiment. It's just testing it out, and it's a bonus if you do get an idea accepted and get paid for it. And I think that's a great way of looking at it for everyone.
Absolutely. And I think there's just a lightness to it, and still you're just enjoying it, because I know a lot of people who have gone down the freelance writing path and loved it so much that then they tried to transition into becoming a full-time freelancer, but it just sucked the joy out for them. So I think you've got to find the balance that works for you.
What would you say for someone considering this as a career, what would you say are the pros and cons of being a freelance writer?
I think that the pros are that there's a lot of freedom and a lot of flexibility, and you get to pursue the things that you're interested in and your passions and your interests. But the potential cons are that it's all up to you. So you have to be motivated. You have to do the work. If you decide to take 2 weeks off, you're not going to get that paycheck. There's no kind of safety net. So I think being prepared, being flexible, resilient and organised helps, as well as having a hunger to achieve, whatever that looks like for you, a hunger to see something through, to pitch some ideas. Because a lot of people I know want to do it, but they're not confident to take the next step. But I think actually your confidence comes from doing it. It doesn't. You won't feel confident just from thinking about it. You've actually got to take the step, and it's a bit scary, but you won't know until you do it.
That's exactly right. And the same with any type of career change, that the thinking doesn't actually do anything. It's actually taking action and trying things that gives you the clarity as to whether it is something that you really want to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the first step towards it is even the imagining of, could I be a writer? I'm interested in this. And then the second step is just taking some small action towards it without putting too much pressure about what it all might mean for you and your career.
It's interesting. I mean, a lot of people that I speak to who love writing and would like to be a writer, many of them are introverts. I don't know if you are an introvert or not.
I am. Yeah, or maybe I'm an ambivert, but
Yeah.
I love people, but I need my own space to recharge.
Yeah. And so I guess a lot of people who do go into writing are introverts, which often means that putting yourself out there and self-promoting and pitching ideas and, that doesn't often come naturally for introverts. So I think that must be quite once you overcome that hurdle and can deal with some rejection and you're willing to keep going, then that's where you'll make the breakthroughs, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good point. And I am definitely on the strong end of the introvert scale. I think for me, it's been helpful to think I've got this great idea and I want to share it with the readers of this publication. I think for me, that takes out some of the fear of feeling like I'm trying to sell them my idea or convince them. Whereas I see it as almost a bit of like an intellectual exercise to think, I've got this topic that I want to write about, this thing. How can I make it irresistible for this editor? And I see it as a bit of a challenge, I think. And you do get lots of rejection, but I think as you do this more and more, you realize that there are so many reasons to be rejected. Like they might have just run a story on that. They might not have any budget to pay you. The timing's not right. It depends what the advertising schedule is like. Like you might come up with an idea that doesn't sit particularly well with an ad that they're going to run or a relationship they've got with an advertiser. And I think when you start and you get your first rejection, you don't know any of that background, and it's easy to absorb that and feel like they hated it, I'm hopeless, I'm never going to be a writer. But actually, there's lots of factors that go into an editor saying yes or no to your pitch.
Yes, and it sounds very similar to when people apply for jobs and they get a rejection. Likewise, there could be 100 different reasons why they didn't get that job. It could be an internal candidate, could be a recruitment freeze. So it's exactly the same, isn't it?
Yes, yeah, I hadn't thought about it, but you're right. It's totally, totally like that.
Now, I'm sure you get asked this all the time. Can we talk about formal versus informal education for writing?
Mm-hmm.
In your experience, would you say that it is necessary to complete a formal course, such as a Bachelor of Creative Writing? Or can people, if they've got natural talents for writing, could they do some, short courses such as the one that you did to learn how to pitch, for example, and still earn an income as a freelance writer?
Yeah, I think my experience is that you definitely don't need a degree in journalism or creative writing or professional writing and editing. It can help, but what I've found is that often people who have that background, that kind of academic background, they don't necessarily have the real life application skills, because freelancing is a lot about, and it's almost like an apprenticeship in a way of like in the olden days that you would do a cadetship at a newspaper and you'd learn on the ground what it was like to see how a newsroom worked. And I think in a way, actually freelancing gives you that apprenticeship in a way that if you're in an academic institution, you don't. And I think there's lots of ways. Yes, you can do courses, but even in the 10 or 11 years since I've been freelancing, there's an explosion of writing podcasts specifically for freelance writers that you can listen to. And I'm happy to give you some of the names of the ones that I really like. There's blog posts. There are so many resources. There's Facebook communities that are really supportive of new fledgling freelancers, because we all remember what it was like and how scary it was to dip your toe in the water and send off your first or second pitch and then get a yes from the editor and then think, gosh, now I actually have to write this article for them.
I would love to, if we can get some names from you, and I'll put those in the show notes. That would be amazing, Lindy.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think in terms of podcasts, there's a great Australian one called The Content Bite, BYTE, and that is with Rachel Smith and Lynn Testoni, who are both super experienced Australian freelance writers. And they have these really pretty short episodes, about 15 minutes of pithy, interesting, useful tips for freelance writers, both established and new. There's also The Writing Coach, which is a podcast by a South African freelance writer and writing coach called Rebecca Weber. And hers is fantastic she has some episodes where she talks people through their ideas, writers through their ideas. So a writer comes to her in a coaching session and you can hear her work with them to get their ideas from this kind of woolly idea that they want to pitch into something that's really sharp that an editor is going to pick up. And there's also the Writers Co-op, which is a great podcast of two American freelance writers. And that's more focused on the business side of running your own writing business, but they also interview different freelance writers. So I would really recommend any of those three podcasts.
They sound fantastic, and I've got to do a few articles myself for my blog, so I think the Writing Coach one sounds like it would be particularly helpful. Speaking of income and being paid as a writer, how do writers actually get paid?
That's a good question, and it's something that really surprised me when I first started, because I had no idea really how you would get paid. And so if you're writing for a magazine, a newspaper, an online website that is linked to a publication, you usually get paid by word. And so that surprises a lot of people. And it doesn't mean that you can just suddenly start chucking in the and to and so to bump up your income for that article. Usually you're given a word count and you get paid for that particular word count. More and more, look, in terms of rates as well per word, it can be anywhere from 20 cents a word, which is considered to be quite low, up to $1 or more a word. More and more publications are starting to move to a fixed rate per article. And one of the complaints that you'll hear lots of writers make is that publications haven't changed their rates. So people who used to write for a particular newspaper or publication 5 years ago are still on the same rate, whereas lots of writers who are writing for corporate organisations are finding that is a really nice way to boost their income, to do that kind of corporate work and then do some of the maybe more creative feature articles where they're pursuing particular topics that they really feel passionate about, and have that balance.
And so is it up to the writer often to negotiate that price, like the, per word price, or is it usually set by the editor or the person engaging them?
So usually the editor will tell you what the word rate is. They might say it's 65 cents a word. And there's a little bit, my experience is there's a little bit of wriggle room with that because they have a budget. And of course they're trying to get you for the least amount so they can make their budget go as far as possible. I think as new writers, you don't have too much negotiation power. You tend to just accept what you're offered. I definitely, with some of my more regular editors, I definitely ask for more and see if there's any room in their budget to just increase that. Often these days, especially now after COVID, there's very little room to move with budgets.
Interesting. That is so interesting. I didn't know that they were paid by word, so I've learned something new for sure. Yeah. Now, in the intro, Lindy, I mentioned that you won this award last year for the Best Food Travel Story. Yeah. Can you tell us a bit about that particular award and about entering competitions in general? Was that a competition that you entered, or was it just an award that you were given? Yeah,
so I'm a member of the Australian Society of Travel Writers, and so that's kind of the peak body for Australian travel writers. It's a organisation that's really highly regarded in that there are quite stringent requirements to be accepted as a member. So initially you have to have at least 7,500 words, travel-related words that you've published each year and that have been paid for by a publication. And then you have to meet at least that many words each year after. So, and to become a full member, you need to have 20,000 travel-related words published each year. So and each year you have to submit your articles for substantiation. So that kind of the committee and the board go through that to make sure that you have met that criteria. And so each year the society, the ASTW, hold an awards night, and there are lots of different categories, and it's a really big deal in the travel writing industry to be nominated and then to win. And so, yeah, I entered my food story of a trip that I took in India with Intrepid, which was a vegan food trip. And yeah, I won, which was huge for me because I know everyone says this, but I actually had I didn't expect to win. So I didn't prepare a speech or anything because I looked and I read all the other finalists' entries and thought, I don't stand a chance. I'm not even gonna prepare a speech. So I probably should have in retrospect.
You will next time. Well done. That's fantastic. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Now, Lindy, you've got your own course now for aspiring freelance writers. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and what someone would learn in that course?
Yeah, so when I started freelancing full-time, so in 2017, I couldn't find any other Australians who were blogging about their experiences. So I thought it was a real experiment for me. My partner was going to stay at home with our 2 kids full-time, and I was going to be the breadwinner. And I felt really nervous about taking that on, but I wanted to see if it was possible to earn good money from freelancing because everyone had kind of said it's impossible. So I started a blog and just wrote about my experience, but also wanted to make it a useful repository, I guess, for freelancers who are looking for help and information. And then last year, I realised that people really wanted there were lots of writers on my list who were saying, we've achieved some success with our writing, but we want to achieve more, because I shared my monthly income from 2017 until the end of last year. I shared my income because I felt like it was really important to be transparent, because I was saying it's possible to earn great money from writing. And I felt like I needed to kind of show my receipts in a way and say, this is what I was earning. And so I had earned 100,000 or over 100,000 each year. And lots of writers were getting in touch saying, how did you do it? So in the middle of last year, I launched my course for established writers called Write, Earn, Thrive, and really helping people who had achieved some level of success with their writing but wanted to double or triple their income. And then I realised, well, actually, there's a lot of people who read my blog and who are on my email list who want to get to that level eventually, but are just not even sure where to begin. So I haven't launched the course yet. So this is early Feb 2021, but in the next month or so, I'm going to be launching the Foundations of Freelance Writing course. And the idea is to help people who are just like me get the lay of the land, because think, like I said before, there's so many things that are unknown and ways to communicate with editors that you just don't know about as a beginner. And I want to pull the veil back on that and say, this is what you need to do. This is how you go from being a total beginner, you've never published anything, you're just dreaming about being a writer, to having an article published and being paid, and seeing your byline, your name in your favourite magazine or newspaper.
Wow. And look, that sounds like it's, that's what people want, isn't it? Just really practical advice and steps to follow, yes, rather than all the, I guess, perhaps some of the theory that they would get in a more formal course. Yeah,
I think for me it's been 10, 11 years of making lots of mistakes and thinking, this is distilling what you need to know and how to do the steps from someone who is still kind of like in the weeds every day, pitching, writing and negotiating all those intricacies.
But that is a fantastic salary to be earning. So that should definitely inspire some people out there that you can definitely make a career in writing, which is fantastic.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think lots of people who are doing my course now are finding the same. They're like, I think just even knowing that someone else has done it, you're like, oh, I can do that. It really helps feel like it's possible.
Lindy, I've got one final question for you.
Yes.
What are 3 key pieces of advice that you would give to others who are keen to pursue a career as a freelance writer?
I think first is don't overthink it. If you're interested in it, just take a step towards it. So whatever that is, doing a course, listening to some of those podcasts I mentioned, reading some blogs, looking for some Facebook communities online that will kind of give you a little bit of a boost to think that it is possible. So I think number one is just do it. Get started in whatever small way. Take some small step of action. I think the other thing to do is to find a community of writers that fits with you. So that might be a physical group of writers in your local community. It might be an online group of writers. I've found that for me, that was so important in keeping me going, because they would share details of how to contact editors. They would say to me, this editor is fantastic to write for. This editor replies to her emails after 10 p.m. Don't write for this one. They never reply. That kind of inside knowledge is so important and really can help you feel confident about continuing on this path. And I think thirdly, just to keep going, just to stick with it and know that there's going to be setbacks and you will get rejection emails to your ideas. But something that really helped me in the early days was I was listening to, I think, a podcast where an advertising executive was talking about how many ideas he had to come up with for a particular ad campaign. And it was something like 45 ideas per week for whatever ad campaign he was working on. And he said that what that taught him was not to be too precious about any of his ideas, knowing that you'll have another idea, you shoot it off into the ether. If it doesn't land, you might be able to repurpose it, repackage it, send it on to another editor. But you just keep going. And I think you develop that sense of resilience and that ability to get up from those rejections. And once you do that, you realize there's so many opportunities for freelancers, especially now because so many businesses have gone online. They need content and they need written content from freelance writers.
That's fun. Well, we're definitely talking the same language, Lindy, because it's the same with any sort of career change. The first thing, you have to start somewhere. You have to take action and you have to find a community. I always say, find your cheerleaders who will support you when you get rejected and will encourage you to keep going. So I love those three pieces of advice. So thank you.
Thank you.
Lindy, look, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on the show today. And I know that our listeners would have learned so much from talking or from listening to you. So look, I just want to wish you the best of luck for this year. And I will I'll look out for your new course so that I can share that with some of my clients, and look forward to hearing of your latest accomplishments when we next catch up.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for having me, Leah.
Been a pleasure. Thanks, Lindy. Have a great day. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Relaunch Your Career. If you did, please subscribe, share with your friends, leave a review, or connect with us on social media at Relaunch Me Career Consulting. If you have any questions about the episode or the work that we do, then contact us via the website relaunchme.com.au. Thanks for listening. Have a great day.